Late at night, on the 16th of June 1944, a squadron of heavy bombers took off from this airfield, RAF Full Sutton near York, to strike industrial targets in Germany. It would be the worst night in the squadron's history. There are many famous failures of the Second World War. Some of them are lucky enough to be immortalised in public memory, like Market Garden, but the vast majority of failures don't get remembered. We don't want to consider the human cost of an action which produced largely negligible results for the war effort. But this is precisely why it's so important that we remember them. This is a story of 77 Squadron and the Sterkrade Raid that went tragically wrong. A month earlier, in May 1944, RAF Full Sutton was just starting operations. It was the last Bomber Command airfield to be built during the Second World War. Moving in was one of the RAF's oldest squadrons, 77 Squadron. They were coming off a particularly tough spell at their previous base, the nearby RAF Elvington. The casualties had been high throughout 1943, but early 1944 had some of the worst. In 5 consecutive raids in January and February, 16 aircraft had gone missing, with 87 men killed and 26 taken prisoner, a loss of 113 men in 2 months. The probability of a crew taking part in all 5 raids and surviving was only 31%. They may have been excited about moving to a new base. It could have meant a change of fortune. They were, after all, getting a new plane. The main RAF bomber we associate with the war is the Avro Lancaster, but 77 Squadron had been flying the Handley Page Halifax since moving to Elvington in 1942. There's only one surviving complete specimen of this aircraft at Elvington Air Museum, formerly RAF Elvington, where 77 Squadron had just moved from. They were now to fly the much improved Mark III Halifax. With more power and better handling than its predecessors, it proved far safer for its crews. With these new bombers, the squadron supported the troop landings on D-Day without any operational losses. This was a promising start, but this fortune would soon reverse. It was clear that one of Germany's biggest strategic weaknesses was its lack of oil. The Allies could draw on their reserves in the US and the British Empire, but Germany had no such reserves and was forced to make synthetic oil from coal in a complex industrial process. Hit the factories producing that oil, the theory went, and the German war machine would splutter to a halt. One of the most important of these synthetic oil factories was at Sterkrade in the Ruhr Valley, Germany's strategic industrial heartland. The Germans recognised its importance and defended it well, but Bomber Command decided to take the risk. Sterkrade must be hit, and the raid would take place on the night of the 16th of June 1944. 25 aircraft from 77 Squadron were assigned to the raid. On the night of the mission, one Halifax failed to take off. The first to actually get off the ground suffered vibrations and had to dump its bombs in the sea before turning back again. 2 bombers were already out of the mission and they hadn't even seen the target yet. The target was here. But they weren't alone. 77 Squadron was part of a massive striking force, with 299 other Halifaxes and Lancasters from bases across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Knowing that German defences would be on high alert, Bomber Command had planned a second raid that same night. More than 400 bombers were to attack V-1 rocket sites around Pas-de-Calais in northern France, in the hope that this would draw away enemy fighters. However, any benefit of this plan was undermined by the fact that the planned route for the Sterkrade raid passed close by a German radio beacon at Bocholt. By complete chance, it had been chosen that night by the Germans to centre their night fighter patrols. 6 aircraft from 77 Squadron fell victim to these night fighters, as well as others from the wider attacking group. As the remaining force neared the target, the plan went wrong again. This time it was the weather. Thick clouds shrouded the target region up to 14,000 feet, making visual bombing impossible. Even with the Pathfinder force marking the target out with flares, the aiming point was obscured. Most bombing was therefore ineffective. All these factors combined to make a nightmare situation. Harassed by enemy fighters, unable to see the target properly, the cost of this raid was quickly escalating and the hoped-for rewards were diminishing. For 77 Squadron, it was the worst night in its history. Of the 25 aircraft which took part in the mission, 6 failed to return home, a casualty rate of 24%. With 27 airmen killed, 16 taken prisoner, and 7 rescued at sea, these were the heaviest losses suffered by the squadron in a single mission. The average age of those killed was 25. The youngest was just 19. It's easy to tell this story from a bird's eye view, just listing numbers and facts, but we don't truly get an insight until we start looking at the people involved, because every single one had a story. Here are just a few. Halifax Q for Queen was returning from the raid when it was attacked by a Junkers 88 and severely damaged. The crew attempted an emergency landing, but as the plane was on fire, they had no choice but to crash land in the North Sea. Miraculously, none were injured in either the attack or the landing, and were spotted by a patrolling Wellington crew who signalled for help. Before they could be picked up by rescue boat and taken to safety, 2 of the air gunners, Rogers and Blackwell, insisted on staying in their turrets in the slowly sinking bomber to guard the rest of the crew in their nearby dinghy from possible air attack. For this heroism, they both received the Distinguished Flying Medal. The pilot, Sid Judd, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. In Halifax A for Able, 5 of the 7-man crew were Australian, and all tragically lost their lives after crashing near Amsterdam. Their remains, and those of the bomber, were not recovered until 1990. They had to wait 47 years to be given a proper burial. Another Australian crewman, Jack Knott, had survived the crash of Halifax J for Jig north of Eindhoven. Listed as missing, he was found to have evaded capture for 3 weeks, having come into contact with the Dutch underground. Hiding in a house with 3 other Allied airmen, they were eventually discovered by the Gestapo. On the 9th of July 1944, the 3 airmen were taken outside and shot. Cora Pulskins, who had hidden them in her house, was later taken to Ravensbrück concentration camp and executed. Henry James F. Turton was a gunner aboard Halifax F for Fox when it was shot down northeast of Rotterdam. Miraculously, the whole crew survived. Turton bailed out with the rest of them, having been shot in his right foot. While the rest of his crew were captured as prisoners of war, he was found the next morning by a Dutch farmer who hid him in his barn. Over the coming weeks, he was passed between various members of the Dutch underground, managing to evade capture for almost 3 months before being liberated by American troops in September 1944. These are just a few of the stories of the men involved in this raid. Every single one of the men had a story. Most of them have been forgotten. A few get relegated to footnotes of niche books or websites, but it's our job to keep telling them. But perhaps the most tragic element of this story is the fact that the effects of the raid were minor. Reconnaissance photos taken the next day suggested that the factory had been damaged, but not significantly enough to stop production. Like so much in the story of the war, the dazzling, valiant, heroic actions which change the course of history only make up a tiny proportion of the total actions taken. There was little time to mourn the losses at Full Sutton. New aircraft and crewmen arrived to replace the ones which had been lost, and soon the squadron was back to operations. The last bombing raid from this airfield was on the 25th of April 1945, just over a week before the surrender of Nazi Germany itself. There's not much left of RAF Full Sutton now. After the war, it stored missiles, was used for training, now is an industrial estate and a private airfield. The only thing that survives is this original runway and a few decrepit buildings. It's incredible to be able to walk down the original runway, the same runway that these bombers would have taken off and landed on, when so much of the time we read history through books or see it in pictures. To actually feel the concrete under your feet brings it to life. This is the last surviving World War II building from the airfield on the site. This was the airfield office, and this in itself is capturing a moment of history, because this is going to be torn down before the end of the year. This is the last tangible reminder we have, apart from the runway, of what happened here. It's easy when we talk about the war to focus on the big stories. We all know about the dam busters and the Battle of Britain. These are heroic, dazzling actions which changed the course of the war. But we struggle to talk about the failures of the war, the things which aren't so interesting, the things which confront us with the reality of these human costs, people who died on a mission which we can't really say achieved anything. But this is why it's so crucially important that we keep talking about them, so that they're never forgotten.